India, Dr. G. Ranganath. And we are also having Mr. Kingshuk Sen from IEI headquarters and Mr. Bhaskar Datta, the convener, Mechanical Engineering Division of West Bengal State Center, IEI, who will also introduce the theme speaker and also say a few words about the theme. So now I request Dr. Nirmal Das, our Honorable Chairman of West Bengal State Center, the Institution of Engineers, to kindly deliver the welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, anyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and particularly good evening to Dr. T. Oakley. Now, Dr. Hemanto Thakre, our President of Institute of Engineers, Dr. Sandeep G, Vice President, Ranganath Ji, Chairman Kate, Dr. N.T. Rangareddy Ji, Chairman Mechanical Engineering Division Board, Dr. Rajiv Boshak, Honorary Secretary, Secretary, West Bengal State Center, Bhaskar Datta, Convener, Mechanical Engineering Division, West Bengal State Center, and our eminent speaker, Tim Buckley, Director, Climate Energy Finance Australia, past and present council members of the institutions, and distinguished corporate members, ladies and gentlemen. An honor to be speaking here today at celebration of energy transition in South Asia and Australian perspectives on the growing need for decarbonization and role of global finance, policy, and technology as accelerator. Being organized by the West Bengal State Center, the Institution of Engineers India. Being the chairman of West Bengal State Center IEI, it is my privilege to address the gathering of eminent engineers and technologies. On this occasion, let me extend a warm welcome to you all, and especially our panel speaker, Mr. Tim Buckley, all corporate members, distinguished guests, the staffs of IEI, and my beloved students and other dignitaries. About today's theme, the energy transition is a pathway towards transformation of the global energy sector from fossil-based to zero carbon by the second half of the century. At this heart is need of to reduce energy-related CO2 emissions to limit climate change. Decarbonization, as you know, involves increasing the prominence of low-carbon power generation and a corresponding reduction in the use of fossil fuels. This involves in particular the use of renewable energy sources like wind power, solar power, and biomass. Spurred by structural permanent changes to energy supply, demand, and prices, the energy transition also aims to reduce energy-related greenhouse gas emission through various forms of decarbonization. Focusing on the decarbonization, our built environment through carbon negative construction and making our current buildings more energy efficient can reduce emission and support more equitable, healthier and communities. In South Asia, energy production is still primarily based on the fossil fuels. Greenhouse gases generated through energy production representing 63% of regional emissions. The transition to low carbon energy in South Asia is a priority and is critical to limiting emissions in this region. However, this transition will need to occur as demand for energy in South Asia source demand has risen by 50% since 2000. The region need for more power is expected to double within this decade. South Asia has made recent progress in providing electricity access to its hardest to reach populations, with Bangladesh, India, and Nepal driving gains to electrification. However, expanding reliability and availability of clean, affordable power remains crucial to consolidate the development gains from improved approach. Hope you are aware that we all are passing through a situation when our existence becomes questionable. the emission challenge in South Asia and the energy sector. However, the scientists say drastic action can still prevent some of the worst case scenarios. Today, we have the eminent speaker who is a distinguished pillar in this field. Let us educate ourselves for awareness and possible mitigation to this change and its impact to sustain our mankind. Thank you once again and welcome you all again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dash, for your welcome address. Now, I request Dr. N.T. Rangareddy, Chairman, Mechanical Engineering Division of IEI, to kindly say something, say a few words, and share his thoughts with us.
Yeah, namaskar. Good afternoon to India participants and good evening to Australian participants. Respected Dr. G. Ranganath, Chairman, CATE, theme speaker of the webinar, Mr. Tim Buckley, Director of Climate, Energy, Finance, Australasia, Mr. Bhaskar Datta, Business Consultant and Vice President Retired, Thasaran Group Industries, Dr. Nirmal Das, Chairman, West Bengal State Center, Dr. Raju Basak, Honorary Secretary, West Bengal State Center, and moderator of the session, Mr. Anirban Datta. A very good afternoon to all of you. Since its inception in 1920, the Institution of Engineers has upheld the mandate of promoting and augmenting the science, practice, and business of engineering through different technical activities and providing insights to the policy makers regarding matters related to engineering profession. Imparting engineering education for working community in a non-formal mode, fostering national and international cooperation in engineering and technology, dissemination and sharing of engineering and technical knowledge through activities on contemporary topics and encouraging, elevating and recognizing the technical knowledge and practice of individuals and organizations through scholarships and awards. Standing at the crossroads of a century of a glorious existence, a little marred by the global pandemic, it was felt appropriate to rethink, introspect, and disseminate ideas, concepts, and best practices in the emerging areas of technology and engineering through virtual platforms, which finally have evolved into IEI Technical Webinar Series. Today, we are all excited at the prospect of listening and gaining insights from our distinguished team speaker, Mr. Tim Buckley, on the energy transition, a South Asia and Australian perspective on the growing need for decarbonization of and role of global finance, policy, and technology as accelerator. Energy can create transformational opportunities for the millions of people in the world who lack access to electricity. The introduction of clean energy solutions can bring vital services such as improved healthcare, better education, and affordable broadband, creating new jobs, livelihoods, and sustainable economic value to reduce poverty. An energy revolution based on renewables and energy efficiency is urgently needed, not just to accelerate economic progress and development, but also to slash emissions that are rapidly warming our planet. Over the next decade, every aspect of national energy systems will be affected by changes in climate and energy policy, and financing continuous technological advancement and shifts in energy supply and demand. The rapidly falling costs of renewable technologies have opened up previously unimagined possibilities across the globe. Ongoing developments in many countries offer a promising outlook for the security, inclusiveness, and sustainability inherent in a transformed energy sector. However, the transition needs to speed up significantly and broaden its scope to achieve our SDG 7 and align with the goals of the Paris Agreement and climate change, while at the same time achieving implementation of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The energy transition can be thus no longer be limited to incremental steps. It must become a transformational effort, a system overall based on the rapid upscaling and implementation of all available technologies to innovate for the future. This is the right moment to reassess long-standing assumptions, perceived barriers, and default decisions. The emerging energy system must promote resilient economies and societies for a more inclusive and equitable world. Ambitious and targeted actions are needed now throughout the coming decades to ensure the goals of Sustainable Development Goals 7 are fulfilled and decarbonized energy system achieved by 2050. I believe that the IEA technical webinar on the emerging topic on energy transition and decarbonization being organized by West Bengal State Center of the institution under the aegis of Mechanical Engineering Division Board of the institution today will be relevant for practitioners, researchers, and will be successful in portraying the opportunities and challenges. I would like to compliment and congratulate West Bengal State Center for taking up this initiative and inviting the well-known speaker for this program. I wish all the best for the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. N.T. Rangareddy, Chairman, Mechanical Engineering Division Board. And you have very correctly, emphasized the role of IEI towards the energy transition. Now, I request Dr. G. Ranganath, who is the Chairman of Committee of Advancement, Technology and Engineering of the Institution of Engineers, to share his thoughts with us. What do you say?
Honorable Dr. Rangareddy, Chairman, Mechanical Engineering Division Board, and good member among the council members, and a good friend of me in council for long years, as well my family friend. Renewable Das, the person who has taken a chairman as a West Bengal Center, Energy Tech Vice President of IEI, good friend of me, Mr. Sandeep Dey. Of course, he came late. That's what we are missing here. Sandeep Dey. Honorary Secretary of the West Bengal State Center, Raju Basak. The moderator is doing a wonderful job in the morning. That's in the afternoon. Anirban Dattaji. The speakers, importantly, the speaker who came from Australia online with us, Mr. Tim Buckley, who is going to talk on theme. Another speaker, Bhaskar Datta sir. All other committee members of West Bengal State Center. The most important audience for this is participants, because more than 50 participants are to listen to our speaker. So good afternoon to all of you. First and primarily, on behalf of IEI headquarters, Institute of Engineers India headquarters, IEI Calcutta, I am so happy to welcome Team Buckley from Australia, the chief speaker for today's program, and my president, vice presidents, and all other council colleagues, and West Bengal State Center. Again, I am so happy to welcome you, Buckley. You are most welcome to India as a speaker today. Then coming to our Nirmal Das, I am attending good number of programs for past about a couple of months. He is covering almost all divisions. Mechanical today, like an international webinar. Earlier, EEE, environmental, energy, marine. I don't think that within the span of 2 years, he is going to leave any division. He is going to have so many programs. So I am very happy, Nirmal Das. Congratulations for you and all the best for your programs too. Now coming to mechanical division, as all of you know, Dr. Rangareddy of becoming chairman of Mechanical Division Board for is encouraging every center, either local or state centers, to come forward to have technical activities like seminars, symposiums, workshops, like in webinars. The first time the webinar we are getting an international speaker, and that too today's emerging topic is most important. It is applicable almost all divisions, we can say, not only for mechanical, as Rangareddy already thrown a light on it. And Nirmal Das was also speaking about it. And I don't want to take much of your time in talking on topic, because more than 50 participants, they are all eagerly waiting to listen. Team Buckley. With this, my wishes to all the centers of West Bengal State Center, Congratulations to the division chairman of Rangareddy and chairman of Nirmal Das, West Bengal State Center. And I am very happy for our Anupam Datta, who is doing a wonderful job as a moderator. Do well. And let me thank all of you to be with all of you this afternoon. Since I had to attend another program at 2:30, I am taking leave of you. Today I am missing our three speakers' speech. Otherwise, I will take it through maybe on YouTube. So thank you all, sir. All the best, Nirmal ji.
Thank you, Dr. Ranganath, for very lucid explanation, and definitely you have very pointed out that energy transition is not limited to only mechanical or electrical engineers, for all the engineering disciplines, definitely. Thank you, sir, once again. Today we are having the Vice President of the Institution of Engineers India, Engineer Sandeep Kumar Dev, a civil engineer by qualification and expert in architecture and valuation. Dev.
Well, thank you, Anirban. I believe that I am audible, right? Am I audible? Yeah. So thank you, Anirban. And I would like to thank the Mechanical Engineering Division and West Bengal State Center for arranging this wonderful webinar. And my special thanks goes to the convener of this program, and who is actually acting as the moderator, Anirban Dotto, and as well as the person behind the entire program arrangement is Engineer Bhaskar Dotto, who is also the convener of the Mechanical Engineering Division. Well, this program is arranged by West Bengal State Center, as already stated by the chairman of CATE, that the endeavor taken by Dr. Nirmal Das, the chairman of West Bengal State Center, is just amazing. Under his leadership, the West Bengal State Center is hello.
Please, others unmute the system, sir. The speaker, please.
Thank you. So it's a wonderful arrangement and leadership given by the chairman of West Bengal State Center, Dr. Nirmal Das, and under his leadership, the entire team of West Bengal State Center is working wonderfully. Now I would like to thank my council colleague, the chairman of Mechanical Engineering Division, Dr. Rangareddy, for sparing his time here. And finally, although his name should come first, our today's guest speaker, Mr. Tim Buckley, Director of Climate Energy Finance Australia, who has kind enough to providing the time for sharing his knowledge on the energy transition, a South Asian Australian perspective on the growing need of decarbonization and role of global finance policy and technology as accelerator. Well, I don't want to speak any further because everybody is waiting for this special lecture by team. Once again, thanking you all for joining here, participate in the weekday and the meet of the day. Thank you to all and welcome you all to this program. Thank you very much.
Mr. Datta, Mr. Bhaskar Datta, please mute yourself, sir. Please mute yourself, sir. Sir, please mute yourself, sir.
Thank you, Engineer Sandeep Kumar Dev, Vice President IE. Thank you, Engineer Sandeep Kumar Dev, Vice President IE. We were supposed to have the President of the institution.
Mr. Datta, please mute yourself, sir. The echo is coming. Mr. Bhaskar Datta, please mute yourself. Please mute, sir. Please. Okay, Anirban, please continue.
Today, unfortunately, our President, sir, Dr. Hemant Ankarrao Thackeray, he has some other engagement today, some sudden urgent commitment. So he could not join, but he has sent and with his blessings and best wishes towards this program, and particularly to our theme speaker, Mr. Tim Barclay. He has sent his greetings. Now, I request the convener of Mechanical Engineering Division of the West Bengal State Center IEI, Engineer Bhaskar Datta, to say a few words about the theme. Why we have chosen the theme, and also to introduce today's theme speaker. Over to you, sir.
So good afternoon to everybody, all the panelists here present in the webinar platform, and all the participants who are listening, and everybody is eagerly waiting to hear out as far as his perspective on the topic which we have chosen. The Tim Barclay is basically a financial analyst covering the global electricity markets with a focus on India and Greater Asia. His works dwell into the technology and finance-driven inevitability of global transition towards a lower emission system. Tim's analysis also extends to examine the risks to potentially stranded fossil fuel assets, energy efficiency, and low carbon finance assets, both in Australia and from a global perspective. IEI and me in particular are grateful to have him on board on IEI initiative to bring in awareness amongst people across the society of India. Tim is the second speaker in the initiative. We have planned to have 4 speaking sessions on this topic of climate energy or climate change menace, which is looming large on the planet. After these 4 speaker sessions, IEI wishes to hold a panel discussion amongst these 4 learned speakers, moderated by an esteemed panel moderator, with an intent to create a takeaway document for IEI to take forward. With these little words, I wish to hand it over to Anirban to carry it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Bhaskar Datta. Now we have come to the point for which we all are waiting so eagerly to hear from today's theme speaker, Mr. Tim Barclay. And as already all the dignitaries have categorically mentioned that today we are all fortunate enough to have him on board. So I now request Mr. Tim Barclay to kindly start his deliberation. We are all eager to hear from you, sir.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone from Sydney, Australia. I will just share my screen. So hopefully that is coming through clearly. So I'm going to talk about 6 key points. Firstly, the global energy transition that we've all heard about in each of the speakers before me. There is a global energy transition underway. It is well underway and it is accelerating because of the convergence of 5 key factors. So I'll just go through each of those factors. Secondly, I will talk about the global capital flight that is from fossil fuels. It is emerging, it is clear, it is causing dislocation. So I will touch on that. Thirdly, I'll look at the Australian Integrated System Plan. We actually had that released today here in Australia. It is a 30-year plan out to 2050 for the decarbonisation of the Australian electricity grid. Fourthly, I will talk about India and the electricity sector and the enormous ambitions in India under Prime Minister Modi's leadership. Fifthly, I'll touch on the convergence of the power, industry and transport sectors, which I believe is going to accelerate technology development. And then I will just go into a little bit of a deep dive on green hydrogen, which is certainly a hugely hyped sector at the moment globally. It's getting a lot of airplay in India and in Australia. And I will just touch on some of the opportunities and promises in that sector. So please let me know if at any point my audio is not coming through clearly. Firstly, the global energy transition. It is well underway, it is accelerating, and it's driven by the convergence of 5 key factors. Firstly, renewable energy deflation. This is a technology-driven deflationary curve. India is at the forefront of that with your enormous progress in solar. So over the last decade, we have seen 10% annual declines in solar costs, 5 to 10% annual declines in wind costs, and more recently, rapid declines in battery costs. Now, that is a decade perspective. We have seen a significant dislocation in the last 12 months. But what I would emphasize is that where renewable energy deflation has stopped for the short term, we are now in a period of fossil fuel hyperinflation in 2022. And so the relative advantage of moving to renewable energy is actually accelerating. So when we look at the global commodity prices across fossil fuels, in the last 2 years, we're all well aware the oil price has more than doubled. The Asian import coal power price has gone up 5-fold, and the Asian LNG, liquid natural gas price, has risen 5-fold in the last 2 years. So not 20 or 30% inflation, but 200 and 500% inflation. So we need to put in perspective, when solar costs have gone up 20%, the cost of thermal power has actually gone up 500% for the fuel costs. So to me, the technology-driven deflation of renewables is 100% on track. The second key driver is global policy developments. Now, we heard a lot of talk going into the COP26 back in November last year, where Korea, Japan, and America all pledged to net zero emissions by 2050. China pledged to peak emissions by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2060. And we heard India pledge net zero emissions by 2070. Now, India clearly is acknowledging the importance of decarbonisation, but it is also acknowledging the importance of the common but differentiated responsibilities agreed to in the Paris Agreement back in 2016. So if developed countries decide to move faster, China can move faster, and then India could potentially move faster as well. At the end of the day, this is a global policy priority, a global policy imperative, and at the end of the day, we need to see the developed world, who caused the majority of the problem, lead in helping solve the problem. The third aspect, and it doesn't get a lot of discussion in India, but I would highlight that pricing in carbon dioxide emissions is a key prerequisite to effectively solving the climate crisis globally. Europe, for the last 15 years, has had an emissions trading scheme. The emissions trading scheme, the ETS, has actually shown enormous positive momentum in the last 2 years. And we've seen the EU ETS pricing move from 20 euros to 80 euros just in the last 18 months. So a 400% increase in the carbon price has been evident. It has been very, very clearly acknowledged by industry and by the power sector and by the governments of Europe, and it is building momentum. But equally important is that China last year, 1 year ago, launched the world's largest national ETS, 4 times the size of the European ETS. And at the end of the day, China is the largest energy system in the world. And so it is critical that China continue to show its leadership. And I'll come back to that point. But at the end of the day, what I'm flagging is that global finance clearly needs a price on carbon in order to solve the climate crisis. And I believe we are seeing increasing moves to a global pricing of carbon dioxide emissions. If the externality is priced in and internalized, then the acceleration of the transition will certainly immediately follow. The fourth factor driving the accelerated energy transition is my sector, the finance sector. So global finance is starting to move and align with the needs of the climate science. We saw going into the COP26 that $130 trillion of global capital had pledged to align their investment portfolios, their banking portfolios, their insurance portfolios with a 1.5 degrees alignment of Paris. So limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So at the end of the day, we have technology developments, we have economic developments, we have policy developments, and we have financial sector developments, all of which are starting to embrace the inevitability and the need for decarbonisation. And when $130 trillion of capital commits to investing in alignment with a 1.5 degree temperature outcome or limit, then anything is possible. And I believe as global finance moves from talking about climate change to acting on climate change, we will see profound changes. I will come back to the role of finance in India because I think there is a huge positive development over the last couple of years that is helping India help solve the global climate crisis. The fifth factor, and the final factor, and inevitably the largest and most important factor, is the climate science. So at the end of the day, we can ignore the science, but the change will happen no matter what we do. And it's about limiting the impact. We saw 2 months ago now, India having extreme, unprecedented heat waves in the start of the, in the spring period. So this phenomena of extreme, unprecedented weather changes is a global phenomena. It has seen my country smashed with fires. It's seen my country smashed with floods. It's seen Europe right now being smashed with unprecedented heat waves, just like India was hit 2 months ago. And we've seen unprecedented bushfires in America and tornado activity. So at the end of the day, until the world collectively addresses the climate science and decarbonizes our economies, the extreme weather events are going to be more extreme and more frequent. So unfortunately, the climate is going to get worse before we have sufficiently acted. So there is a huge global imperative. There is an economic imperative, and India, I believe, is going to play a very important role. So moving on to my second theme, the fossil fuel capital flight. At the end of the day, I mentioned $130 trillion of capital has pledged to 1.5 degrees. Now, that pledge is starting to see real evidence of impact. So the International Energy Agency last week released the World Energy Investment Report. It's available online for free. It is worth reading. It highlights how global capital is really responding to the climate science and the growing technology, policy, finance, and economic imperative, let alone the climate science. So what this chart from the International Energy Agency highlights is that there has been tens of billions of dollars of reductions in capital investments by major fossil fuel groups around the world. What we also see from this chart is that there has not been a corresponding replacement of that capital investment in fossil fuels with investment in zero emissions alternatives. So, for example, the Chinese non-national oil companies have barely invested any money in zero emissions technologies. The US oil majors, Exxon and Chevron, have barely invested any money in solutions. So at the end of the day, these huge incumbent industry players bring enormous balance sheet and enormous market power. Until they actually start to address the solutions required, we're not going to have sufficient capital deployed. And I would argue that is why we are seeing rampant hyperinflation in fossil fuels right now across the world. Now, again, drawing another chart from the International Energy Agency World Energy Investment Report from last week, this chart does show something that's worth bearing in mind. In India, like in Australia, we talk a lot about coal. Australia is the world's largest exporter of coal. India is the second largest importer of coal. and it's the second largest producer of coal in the world, and it's the second largest consumer of coal in the world. So we hear a huge amount about coal. But as this chart shows, coal power investment has actually been shrinking now, in fact, for a decade, and is below $50 billion, still a large number. But we look at the amount of money going into solar every year, and solar is $240 billion this year, which is more than 4 times the investment going into coal power each year. Likewise, wind is $150 billion of annual investment, and that is 3 times the amount going into gas power or nuclear power. So we need to put in perspective that nuclear, hydro, gas, and coal, the traditional mainstream sources of power generation, are actually being dwarfed by the annual investment in solar and wind. And India is very much at the forefront of that globally. India is the 3rd largest investor in wind and solar in the world, behind China and America. And India is set to double that in annual investment in the next 2 years. So I will come back to that. But I just thought I would really emphasize the amount of money going into solar is 4 times the amount of money going into coal. And there is a huge amount of capital flowing in grid transmission and distribution, which are key enablers of growing energy consumption, of electrification of everything, and the modernization of the grid to incorporate ever higher penetrations of solar and wind. And then on the right, you'll see battery storage is mentioned. It is growing from a small base, but it is growing globally at very, very significant levels. And Australia is probably the 2nd largest investor in battery storage in the world. India has talked a lot about batteries in the last 2 to 4 years. Everyone keeps saying it is 2 years away from being commercially viable. I can tell you firsthand, in Australia, we are building probably 10 of the 20 biggest battery operations in the world right now across my country, and it is being done without any government subsidies. So it is only a matter of 1 to 2 years before India follows suit and sees a huge uplift in investment in batteries. And not to belabor the point, China is absolutely leading the world on renewable energy investing. Now, China invests more in what the IEA has labeled here, renewable power generation, RPG. China spends as much in renewables this year and last year as the entire advanced economies of the world put together. So I'll just repeat that. China alone, as one country, invests as much in wind and solar in 2021 and 2022 as every other developed country in the world combined. So again, I think that is really an important observation, and part of why I actually got involved in the energy markets. China is investing, they are the world's #1 investor in wind and solar installation. They're the world's #1 manufacturer of wind and solar. They are the world's biggest buyer and manufacturer of electric vehicles, the biggest buyer and manufacturer of batteries, of hydro, of pumped hydro, storage, of nuclear, of grid transmission and smart meters, and green hydrogen. So for all that much of the press in my country belabors that China is the world's biggest producer, consumer, and importer of coal, they are also the world's biggest investor in all of the technologies of the future. And so China, who has an intergenerational perspective when it comes to investing, is 100% invested in zero emissions technologies. Don't let the media tell you otherwise. The facts are China is the biggest investor in the world and is embracing the technology, investment and employment opportunities and the energy security that will bring as it reduces its reliance on imported fossil fuels, a key point for India to consider. And I'll come back and talk about hydrogen shortly, but when I talk about hydrogen growing very, very rapidly, green hydrogen, China is the world's leader. The biggest green hydrogen project in the world that's operating today outside of China is 20 megawatts. So it's tiny, 20 megawatts. It's in Canada. It was commissioned less than a year ago. And China, by comparison, has an electrolyzer that is 7.5 times bigger. And by next year, they'll have one that is 10 times bigger than the biggest operating outside of China. So I will stop there on my China reference, but it is worth bearing in mind, this is a technology race. China is absolutely leading. America used to lead, but China is absolutely leading the world. And I think it is really important. I'll get to India in a minute, but India sees enormous opportunity under Prime Minister Modi and Energy Minister R.K. Singh. And I think it's really, really a huge opportunity for India as well. So I'll just spend 1 minute on Australia. Australia is not a huge economy, but we are the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world. I'll say that again. Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, behind only Saudi Arabia and Russia. And yet, even as our industry is playing a very obstructionist role, the Australian Energy Market Operator today released the updated integrated system plan out to 2050 for the electricity sector in Australia. And as you might see just from the shape and colours of the chart in front of you, renewable energy is going to play a dramatically bigger role in Australia within a short couple of years relative to where we are today. Our new federal government, elected at the start of this month, has committed to 82% renewables by 2030. Today, last year, we're at 31% renewables. Today, we're at 33% renewable energy penetration. That is almost 3 times where it was 1 decade ago. But the government's target now in Australia is to increase to 82% renewable energy by 2030. And we are seeing a dramatic transformation of the Australian electricity sector, a massive decarbonisation, a massive electrification of everything, and that should drive deflation of energy prices for the consumers in Australia. So I wanted to just draw that out for you because India is looking at this. India is moving and starting to accelerate the transition. Australia, despite our government, is a world leader in this. And I'll leave you on Australia with one number out of the integrated system plan, and that is that by 2050, Australia is expecting to have 68 gigawatts, 68,000 megawatts of distributed rooftop solar across the country. That is a 4-fold expansion on where we are today. And India, by comparison, is around 5 gigawatts of distributed solar. Now, distributed solar is going to be half of the Australian electricity grid in terms of capacity by 2050. And, a third of the capacity by 2050. And it becomes really important in a country with the high population density that you have in India that we need to use spare land, and the best spare land is in fact on our rooftops. Maybe a little more of a challenge in India given high-rise buildings, but I flag that as a huge change in the nature of the grid from a centralized power generation system to a very decentralized, distributed two-way power flow market. It is a fundamental change, and Australia is now anticipating that at certain times of the day on a regular basis, we will have 100% instantaneous variable renewable energy penetration within 3 years. So I'll say that again. Within 3 years, we'll have 100% instantaneous variable renewable energy penetration. So the grid dynamics are changing very rapidly. And the biggest obstacle to Australia's electricity transformation is, in fact, lack of engineering capacity. And that was highlighted by the Australian Energy Market Operator very clearly today. So to your institution's credit, you are going to play a critical role in the decarbonisation and expansion and development of India's energy system and energy independence. Australia certainly is going to be looking for a lot more engineers, a lot more electricians to build out our capacity. And so I'm expecting similar employment growth for India. So just to move on to the Indian electricity sector, India has, under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, a world-leading ambition for 450 gigawatts of variable renewable energy by 2030. Now, that contrasts to 110 gigawatts today, or as of March 2022. So going from 110 gigawatts to 450 gigawatts in just a short 8 years is a dramatic change. But it's worth noting on the right, you'll see next to renewable energy, 15.4 gigawatts of the total new capacity adds in India last fiscal year. There was 17.3 gigawatts of total capacity adds, and 15.4 gigawatts was renewable energy. So, and another half a gigawatt was hydro. So in fact, more than 90% of the net capacity added to the electricity grid in India last fiscal year was in fact renewable energy. So I highlight that there is significant progress. That was almost a doubling of the annual installs of renewables in India last year. And we need to see that double again in the next year or two to put India on track for 450 gigawatts by 2030. Now, what this table also demonstrates is in the third from right column, the percent of generation from each source. Coal is still by far the dominant source of generation. 72% of power generated in India last fiscal year was from coal. Renewable energy might be 27% of capacity, but it's only 10.8% of generation. And so we need to see an enormous amount of capacity added, because you can see in the second from right column, the utilization rate on renewables is very low, particularly in India. 17% is very low by global standards. So what we do need to see is India invest in more modern capacity for wind and solar, and for tracking, and for bifacial solar modules. In Australia, we have probably the same solar radiation as Rajasthan or Gujarat or Tamil Nadu, but our solar utilization rates are double that of India. And so at the end of the day, what you need to do is maximize the quality of the investment being undertaken and to embrace the best technology, the most modern technology, rather than going for volume. We've got to go for value as well. So just a set of numbers, hopefully not too many numbers to hit you with, but 90% of the net new capacity added across India last fiscal year was renewable energy. Now, in the last 2 months, so the first 2 months of the new fiscal year, 100% of the net new capacity, 101%, was from variable renewable energy, from wind and solar. In the first 2 months of this fiscal year, 100%. So it's obviously only a 2-month data point, but I am looking for India to increase its installs 30 or 40 or 50% in terms of renewable energy in the next 12 months. And I would therefore expect very little new thermal capacity to be added at all. There will be some new capacity added, but remembering coal power plants are aging. And so every year you are going to see 1, 2, 3 or 4 gigawatts of coal power capacity closing because it's end of life. So you actually are close to seeing maximum thermal capacity in India. And at the end of the day, investors are moving to the lowest cost and lowest emissions alternatives, and that is building India's energy security. Now, there was a couple of landmarks reached in the last week. Now, normally when I talk about solar in India, we are talking about utility scale on land, but there have been 2 huge world-leading projects commissioned in the last week. Firstly, NTPC commissioned, at the time, the world's 2nd largest floating solar installation, second only to China. It was 92 megawatts at Kerala. And then this week we saw Tata Power trump NTPC and commission a 102 megawatt floating solar project. So the 2 of the 3 largest floating solar projects in the world are now in India. So that is a bit of an engineering feat for India. It is certainly a very clear kudos for India to acknowledge the opportunities, the technology innovation and the scale of the opportunities for building zero emissions domestic energy generating capacity that frees and will reduce India's reliance on imported fossil fuels. And so with the floating solar announcement last week by NTPC, they reached their 2 gigawatt milestone last week, which is a huge increase from virtually a standing start only 2 or 3 years ago. But NTPC has a vision to build out 30 or even 60 gigawatts of renewables by 2032. So I expect us to be seeing a lot more from NTPC as India's largest power generation firm. And it certainly reached a good milestone last week. Now, at the end of the day, I've talked a lot about renewable energy. This is a chart from a report that came out yesterday from EY in India. It's a very detailed report about the energy transition. It's worth reading. I've got the link there. I'm happy to provide the slides to IEI after this presentation. But what it shows on the left, excuse the small font, but I'll just highlight the left orange bar is the price of new built non-pithead coal in India. So EY says that it costs between 6 and 7 rupees per kilowatt hour to build a new non-pithead coal power plant. If it was a pithead coal-fired power plant, a new pithead, it would cost you around 5 rupees. But wind and solar would cost you less than 3.5 rupees. So investors at the end of the day are investing in alignment with the climate challenge, but they're just following the economics. At the end of the day, the cheapest source of new power generation in India is wind and solar, or it's solar followed by wind. Now, what this chart on the right in blue is showing, the cost of firming solar or wind is very, very high as yet. It will drop relatively rapidly, but I try to put aside the idea of requiring or thinking about a solar project having to firm it. At the end of the day, grid firming is a problem and an opportunity for the grid. Each solar project doesn't have to firm itself. Each coal plant doesn't firm itself. Each hydroelectricity plant in India doesn't firm itself. The grid system has firming. And so what you need to see is a power price that reflects the price across the time of day. And when it is sunny, we know the power price is going to be low as India builds ever more solar projects. And when the sun is out, when the sun has gone down, we know the power price is going to go up in the evening peak. You need that differential to actually incentivize flexible peaking power rather than the outdated idea of baseload power. I can go into that in more detail if there are questions, but to me, the baseload power construct is a fossil fuel construct that is relevant a decade ago, but entirely obsolete in this decade. Now, this is again a chart from EY's new report using JMK's data. Across India at the moment, there is 102.7 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity that's been announced or permitted or under construction. So there's 23 gigawatts under construction. It's maybe, to me, a little problematic that only 14 gigawatts of that is wind, whereas the vast majority, 61 gigawatts, is solar. And what we really need to see is a lot more distributed solar. But the wind, at the end of the day, wind is very seasonal in India, and that is problematic, but it is a natural resource. It is a zero emissions resource. It's a domestic resource, and wind is complementary to solar and hydro. And so I think it really, and India has one of the biggest wind manufacturing capacities in the world. It is problematic that India is only doing 1 or 2 gigawatts a year of wind when the government of India targeted 5 to 10 gigawatts a year of wind installs to complement their solar. Just moving on, again, to me, renewable energy is an infrastructure investment when the government of India provides a 25-year power purchase agreement. And so one of the key developments in India over the last couple of years has been the building of wind and solar infrastructure, leveraging capital at an enormous scale, whether that is domestic Indian capital or global capital. It is actually a combination of both. And so I emphasize that for 450 gigawatts of renewable energy to be built in India this decade, you need upwards of $500 billion, $500 billion US dollars of investment in the wind, in solar infrastructure, in grid firming capacity, and in grid transmission and distribution. So $500 billion is a huge, huge investment opportunity. The good news is capacity has been building. And just one example of that came out in April, where Tata Power, one of the largest renewable energy developers in India, tied up with BlackRock, which is a US asset manager that manages $10 trillion of capital. And so it is just one of many transactions that have come out over the last 2 years to build financial capacity to allow a doubling of India's annual renewable energy installs. So I am very confident the capital is there, the government policy is there, the energy need is there, and the hyperinflation in imported fossil fuels makes it an Indian imperative to build out domestic renewable energy. So I'll just finish with a couple of points about why I think the global energy imperative or transformation is actually accelerating. And it is the fact we are seeing industry, energy, and transport sectors converging. So by that, I'm referring to the rollout and development of electric vehicles in replacement of the internal combustion engine. We've heard a bit about it in India, but in China, electric vehicle installs year to date are up 90% year on year in a market where total car sales are down 12% year on year. And so electric vehicles penetration in Europe, in China, increasingly in America is really, really accelerating. And the opportunity for India to replace its hundreds of billions of dollars of imported oil every year with domestic renewable energy powered electric vehicles is huge. And it should start in the two-wheeler and three-wheeler markets, in the taxi and bus markets, and then build out into the passenger, four-wheel passenger market. But we are seeing convergence of industry, energy, and transport, and that is accelerating technology development. Just one global example, a company from Australia, Rio Tinto, one of the biggest mining companies in the world, one of the 10 biggest energy buyers in the world, has really been a decarbonisation laggard until October last year, when Rio Tinto trebled its decarbonisation objective by 2030. They now committed to a 50% decarbonisation by 2030. They're committed to investing $10 billion in decarbonisation assets this decade. And Rio Tinto, one of the biggest mining companies in the world, is committed to decarbonisation. Now, it's not doing it because it wants to be a nice, upstanding corporate citizen. It's doing it largely because global investors are demanding that global firms have a very clear decarbonisation objective, a very clear 2030 interim target, and increasingly global companies are doing that. Just finishing on the theme of industry, energy, and transport convergence, this year started with an amazing announcement in Sweden where the development of green steel, we've been talking, the steel industry has been talking about green steel as a potential next decade, 2 decades away, maybe. But the reality is the technology developments in the last 2 to 4 years have been staggering. And so the biggest green steel developer in the world by a mile is SSAB of Sweden. And they announced that they were bringing forward their 100% decarbonisation of the Swedish steel industry by 15 years to 2030. So they'd previously targeted 2045. And at the start of this year, they brought forward that target by 15 years to 2030. So most people in the steel industry globally have said you can't do zero carbon steel. Like, steel is the combination of iron ore and coking coal in most people's parlance. And I say that as an Australian, where Australia is the largest exporter of coking coal in the world. We supply 55% of the world's coking coal seaborne trade. And so in my country, everyone's rubbished the idea of green steel for many, many years. And now Sweden is saying they have already produced the first steel, virgin steel, with no coking coal and no carbon emissions. And their objective is to do that across 100% of the Swedish steel industry as soon as 2030. So that is certainly a world-leading event, and it shows the technology acceleration that is driving the decarbonisation. I'll just very quickly touch on green hydrogen. We have seen a lot of talk of green hydrogen, but in the last 2 years, a huge scaling up, a tenfold expansion in electrolyzers installed globally in the green hydrogen space. Now, that becomes very, very relevant in India, where India has set an objective of having 5 million tonnes per annum of green hydrogen production by 2030. India today has zero production of green hydrogen. So that is a world-leading ambition by the Indian government. And interestingly, two of India's two largest industrial conglomerates have both made huge aspirational targets to drive and lead the development of green hydrogen and renewable energy in India. So by that, I'm talking about the Adani Group, and they only a couple of weeks ago announced a huge tie-up with Total of France and a $50 billion investment commitment this decade in Indian green hydrogen. The second one is Reliance Industries, one of India's most successful companies, and Mukesh Ambani last year really staggered me and the market by coming out with a commitment to net zero emissions by 2030 and a target to invest $75 billion in decarbonisation this decade. So we're watching this space. It's yet to be confirmed, but obviously when Reliance and Adani move, anything is possible. And I'll just finish on an Australian note. We also saw this month an announcement by BP of Europe buying a 40% stake in the biggest green hydrogen project in the world. It happens to be in the Pilbara in Australia. It involves building 26 gigawatts of renewable energy and then converting that to hydrogen. And BP invested and took a controlling 40% stake only 2 weeks ago. So that's one of the mega projects being considered, but there are in fact probably 20 projects of this sort of size being considered. So it's amazing the amount of capital that is on the edge of being deployed, and that will accelerate the global energy transition, and that will bring huge energy independence gains for India and hopefully relief from the hyperinflation in fossil fuels that we're seeing today. So with that, I will end my formal remarks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tim. It was really a wonderful deliberation from your side, and we, practically speaking, we all became practically mesmerized with your the way you have emphasized, particularly the Australian context and in Indian scenario. And practically today we have a very conglomerate audience with us, people from very top shot people from coal mining sector as well as coal-based thermal power generation, consultancy, large consultancy houses of India involved in thermal power as well as renewable sectors, EPC players, and academicians who were practically involved in all of these sectors. And of course, I forgot to mention about electric vehicle. People from EV sector, they have attended as audience, what I could say. And we are also having questions from the member of audiences. Before we take up the questions from the audiences, Tim, I have 2-3 points to know from you, your side, because both Australia and India, their economy and energy pattern, that is so far historically it was predominantly based on coal. As you have very correctly pointed out that Australia is the largest exporter of coal, and India is the second largest importer of coal and also the second largest coal miner, actually. Indigenous from coal, indigenous sources, India exploration is very high, and Indian per capita energy consumption that is still in the growing path, that is much less compared to Europe, US, or China, or Australia. So this energy mix, this moving away from coal-based thermal power generation, so how it will be affecting the per capita energy demand, which will be much more rising in this decade and next decade. So how this will be affecting in positive way or negative way the shift towards the renewable energy, that practically deflation of renewable energy and super high inflation, as you have pointed out in 2022, it has been observed towards the fossil fuel based energy generation. So in coming few years, this paradigm shift, how will affect the overall energy economy in India?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point, that both India and Australia are very, very reliant on coal. I will paint a very different picture. I think the contrast for India versus Australia. So firstly, let me emphasize that the outlook for coal in Australia is very different to India. In India, I would expect, and as you've seen, all of my expectation is that India will build a dramatic increase in renewable energy over the next 1 to 2 decades. But unless India delivers 35 or 40 gigawatts a year of new renewable energy, we will still see increased demand for coal power generation. So 30 to 40 gigawatts of renewables would meet all of the incremental energy demands for India each year. So I'm not suggesting the Indian coal power generation or coal production will go down. I'm saying that most likely I expect it to plateau or grow very moderately over the coming decade. So plateauing would be the key word I would use. You use the word the share will decline each year. The share of capacity, the share of generation will decline, but the absolute coal power generation will probably still increase for the next couple of years marginally. So that is very, very different to what the outlook for is in Australia. So again, I referenced the integrated system plan in Australia that came out this morning. The Australian Energy Market Operator forecasts that 60% of Australia's coal fleet will close in the next 8 years. So in India, I would be looking at coal power fleet to peak in the next 2 to 4 years, not to decline at all. But in my country, 60% of the coal-powered fleet is expected to shut in just the next 8 years. So we need to have our eyes open to the magnitude of the change, the speed of the change, but I would emphasize that will happen slower in India, as is entirely justified under the common but differentiated responsibilities of Paris. And as you mentioned, the fact that India's energy demand is going to grow quite aggressively as your economy, your economic activity grows. Energy consumption is highly correlated with GDP. And so I am expecting very strong GDP growth from India over the next 10, 20 years, and that will require a lot more energy. And then again, maybe to any coal mining executives on this call, the biggest single opportunity for the coal sector in India is actually to replace the imported coal reliance. 20% of India's coal use comes from imported coal. If you're going to burn coal, you might as well burn your own coal and get the jobs and the investment in your domestic economy rather than importing really hyperinflation costed coal from overseas. So at the end of the day, coal mining in India is probably going to grow for another 5 years before it too plateaus. But I would, on the negative side, remind you, part of why we're talking today is that India needs to be cognizant that the capital needs of India are huge. And a lot of that capital is going to come from developed countries, I hope. Those developed countries have committed to investing in decarbonisation. There is no point India ignoring the global capital market needs, because you just won't get the capital access that you need. So that's why I really applaud the moves by Reliance, by Adani, by Tata, by Renew Power, as world leaders in renewable, and NTPC, sorry, I should mention them as well. As world leaders in renewable energy development, at the end of the day, India needs to keep the existing base power generation going and then invest as fast as they can in domestic, cheap, renewable energy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the very important takeaway from your explanation was that India should place more thrust on utilizing its indigenous coal reserve and to gradually cut down the import of coal from external sources. Definitely, it is an important takeaway. My next question to you will be that, as you have very correctly mentioned, that electric vehicle and phasing away of the internal combustion based vehicle. So particularly because in India, vehicular pollution, emission from vehicle, that is a very grave challenge for Indian environmental scenario, environmental dynamics. So, but the other side of the story is, as far as the domestic and personal segment is concerned, price of a electric car of practically same rating as compared to a diesel-driven or a petrol-driven car is practically twofold or 2.5-fold at this point of time. So in the last few months, practically for the last 1 year, we have witnessed practically a rocketing high escalation in fuel price, in petrol and diesel price. But that was going very, but now it has been a bit stabilized and come down to around 10 rupees per liter for petrol. So will this price hike, I mean this hike in the fuel price, can it have a potential to play as an accelerator so that the people like us who normally rely, so far we have relied on for the petrol or diesel driven personal vehicle, will be forced to move on to the purchasing electric vehicle, even if the initial investment is high compared to a petrol or diesel driven vehicle? Will that play a role of an accelerator?
Yeah, it is certainly a challenge for India. At the end of the day, capital is expensive, and so electric vehicles are very much a high upfront capital cost compared to internal combustion engine equivalents. But as you also point out, the oil price has trebled earlier this year. It has come off a little bit, but the acceleration of oil prices is crippling the Indian current account deficit. It is crippling your currency. It is driving rampant inflation, which is pushing interest rates up. And I'm not picking on India. Australia, America, Europe all have exactly the same problems as we see enormous fossil fuel driven inflation smashing our interest rates and damaging economic growth. So at the end of the day, it's about evaluating the total life cycle cost of a car and not just the upfront cost, but that then also comes down to government policy and it's also a part of the global capital flows. There is huge employment and investment opportunities for India in batteries, in two-wheel electric vehicles, in three-wheel electric vehicles, in passenger vehicles, in buses, and in heavy transport. And unlike my country, you obviously have 1.4 billion people. You have a huge domestic market. That is a huge investment opportunity. So I was just reading today about the huge investment going on in Germany in this area, and parts of Germany that have been stagnating for a couple of decades are now in an absolute boom because of all the jobs that Germany is getting in electric vehicle manufacturing, in battery manufacturing. And in fact, CATL, which is the biggest battery manufacturing company in the world, it's a Chinese company. They're building the biggest battery factory in Europe, in Germany, as we speak, and they're employing thousands and thousands of workers. And so there was a really interesting article in the UK Financial Times this morning talking about the boom that is hitting some East German cities and areas. And so I just mentioned that with a transformation comes investment opportunity, and there will be some upfront costs. There are some implementation headwinds, as you say, but I'll finish by saying 2 points. The air pollution in India makes this a health imperative. The current account deficit makes it an economic imperative. And the global comparison, I'll just remind you, in the first 5 months of 2022, Chinese electric vehicle sales grew 90% in a total passenger market that declined 12%. So at the end of the day, there are like BYD, which is the second largest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world. It's a Chinese company again. They actually 2 months ago ceased production of internal combustion engines, not in a decade's time, 2 months ago. And so they were one of China's biggest internal combustion engine manufacturers. They just ceased doing it because demand for their electric vehicles grew almost 300% this year. They needed the factory space, they needed the workers, and they needed 100% focus on the future, not on the legacy business. And they just shut it down overnight. So I don't think India is quite there yet. I know my country's nowhere near there yet. We've got the lowest EV penetration in the world, and it's something I'm ashamed of. But on the flip side, Australia produces 48% of the world's lithium, and lithium is key to electric vehicles. So every time I talk to my government, every time I talk to investors in my country, I emphasize the enormous mining opportunities for my country. So at the end of the day, the money will flow where the growth is, where the investments are, and the money is flowing to electric vehicles. The price will come down, and it will progressively get better for India, but maybe not quite right now, as you say. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, team. Practically, it was an eye-opener, I must say. And my another thing I would like to ponder upon that as far as energy and environment linkage is concerned, one part is decarbonization, another part is carbon capture. So for the proper energy mix and impact on the environment. So in both India and Australia, in next few years, how much there will be share of investment? How it should be the share of investment on decarbonization, and what should be the ideal share on the carbon capture?
Yeah, that's a very controversial question in my country because, as I mentioned, as we've agreed, Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels. And so our industry, our incumbent industry, is very, very reluctant to acknowledge the climate science. Our government has been reluctant to acknowledge the inevitability of this until the federal election we've just had. At the end of the day, the people of Australia have voted, and we are going to change. But One of the excuses that the industry, the fossil fuel industry, has been pushing very aggressively in my country is the myth that carbon capture and storage is going to play a key role. We've been talking about carbon capture and storage in Australia for 20 years. We have literally one CCS project of commercial scale operating in the last 5 years. It's called Gorgon. It's in it's a gas carbon capture and storage project, and it's operated at 50% of its commercial rate for 5 years since it was built. So it's 50% off schedule. It took a multi-billion-dollar investment, and it is certainly, there is no other CCS project under construction in my country as we speak. And as I said, we have been talking about CCS for 20 years. I do hear CCS mentioned in India. I would challenge any of your listeners to point to a single CCS project that's under construction in India today of commercial scale. And at the end of the day, I'll say that because there is no price on carbon emissions in India. There is no price on carbon emissions in Australia. By contrast, Europe does have a very high price on carbon, and particularly the UK is investing billions of dollars as we speak in CCS projects, particularly in the North Sea. So I did note with interest Reliance Industries talking about blue hydrogen a couple of months ago. They had been very, very firmly committing to 100% decarbonisation by 2035, firmly committed to renewable energy and green hydrogen. They're starting to talk a little bit more about blue hydrogen. I will call that out. Absent a carbon price, I don't believe blue hydrogen will play any material role globally. So that's a controversial statement, I know, but I do not believe carbon capture and storage will work. You look at the International Energy Agency's forecast of 20 years ago and compare their forecasts for CCS, which were through the roof, versus the zero, almost zero. There's 40 million tons a year of carbon dioxide supposedly sequestered globally in CCS projects, 40 million tons. That's about 98% lower than what the industry said that they'd have built by today, 10 years ago. And of that 40 million tons, 75% of it is in fact enhanced oil recovery, meaning using carbon dioxide to get more oil out of the fields for burning. So it in fact is nothing to do with carbon dioxide reduction. It's all about producing more fossil fuels. So in fact, there's only 10 million tons of CCS operating in the world and 30 million tons of CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage. That is a euphemism for enhanced oil recovery. So I'll call bullshit on that one. I'm not a believer in CCS.
Thank you, definitely. And before I take up the questions from the audience, my last query to you would be that what is the immediate future of green steel production? Because Tata Steel Europe, they initiated a research project that was a pilot project actually named Hisarana, where they planned to have charging poor quality of poor grade of iron ore, inferior grade of iron ore, as well as charging of scrap in the fourth and fifth campaign of the blast furnace. But that project is yet to be materialized in a commercial scale. That is still in a pilot project scale. So in India and Australia, in next few years, how much is the future potential for green steel production?
Yeah, very good question. And yes, I do follow Tata Steel very closely. I mentioned the Swedish development as not as an example of general industry practice, but as world leading first. The fact that they brought forward the timeline by 15 years, they do have a carbon price. We don't, India doesn't. So therefore, we will be behind Europe. But we still will see virgin steel primarily coming from blast furnaces for at least the next decade or two. What I would note is that at the start of this year, ArcelorMittal committed to a 40% emissions reduction in their steel operations in France and the closure of all 3 of their French blast furnaces. So at the end of the day, the steel industry is acknowledging the threat of and the need for decarbonisation. But at the end of the day, it is very difficult and costly at the moment to decarbonise a blast furnace. So what is worth bearing in mind is the enormous growth in electric arc furnaces. And I think in America has something like 70% electric arc furnaces, and they have one of the highest steel recycling rates in the world. So I don't normally point as America as a world leader, but in the steel industry, they actually have one of the lowest emission steel industries in the world. And so I think you're going to find global investors are really reluctant to invest in any new blast furnaces anywhere in the world. And it will be a gradual transition because blast furnaces, as we know, last for 20, 30, 40 years. And so there's a big inertia in there. But you can progressively decarbonize a blast furnace by substituting in hydrogen, green hydrogen. You are going to see electric arc furnaces grow. In my country, we don't produce much steel at all. I think India produces 5% of the world's steel. My country produces 2.2%. Sorry, I'll say that again, 0.2% of the world's steel. We're tiny as a steel producer, but we are 38% of the world's iron ore production. And so the really big challenge from all of our 4 major iron ore companies, and they are 4 of the 4 largest iron ore companies in the world. We are the biggest exporter of iron ore, 38%, as I said. And so we are seeing, particularly Fortescue Future Industries, investing $500 million this year alone in decarbonisation, research, development and deployment. And they've committed to net zero emissions by 2030 for Scope 1 and Scope 2, 100% emissions reduction in Scope 3 by 2040. Aspirational, but they are investing probably more than any other company in the world in the steel supply chain in decarbonisation. And so I expect Australia to, within a decade, be the world's biggest exporter of green iron rather than iron ore. So at the end of the day, we have huge renewable energy potential. We could actually use the zero emissions renewable energy to actually decarbonise some of the iron ore before we export it. At the moment, 100% of our iron ore is exported with absolutely no onshore processing. So that is where the biggest opportunity in Australia. It's our #1 export. We export about $100 billion a year of iron ore. And so it's a huge decarbonisation opportunity for the world, but we've barely started is unfortunately the answer. So a bit like India, there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action to see as yet. But I think watch this space. It is going to move far faster than people were thinking even 2 years ago.
Thank you, team. So now I am taking up the questions coming from the members of audience. Mr. Gaurav Karande from Reliance Industries, he has asked that does offshore wind energy is a good option in India for use?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The Indian government has been working with the European Wind Association, Offshore Wind Association, for 5 years now, exploring the opportunities for Indian offshore wind with a focus on Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, where the best offshore wind resources are. I am relatively cautious on offshore wind for both India and Australia. Australia's Victorian government about 6 months ago announced a major investment in offshore wind, but part of that is offshore wind provides geographic diversification from onshore wind. It's a different wind pattern. It's a very expensive source of electricity compared to onshore wind. But at the end of the day, if you put a price on carbon dioxide, offshore wind would play a commercial role. India and Australia don't have a price on carbon dioxide, so I think offshore wind is probably still a decade away from commercialization. It could provide 50 gigawatts, 100 gigawatts of potential for India, but I would say that probably won't be realized until 2040. I would be pushing India to develop onshore wind, distributed solar and utility solar first, and leaving offshore wind technologies to develop. It was interesting, a decade ago, I was looking at offshore wind in China. China announced enormous offshore wind targets by 2020. They missed every one of those targets. They effectively put the industry on hold for a decade. They let the Germans and the Brits develop the technology, drive the cost down 50, 60, 70, 80%. And now in 2021, China, out of nowhere, became the #1 installer in offshore wind in the world. So it can change. That will change the economies of scale, the technology development. When we're talking about offshore wind, we're talking about turbines of 5 to 10 megawatts per turbine. Onshore turbines are 2 megawatts, maybe 3 megawatts. So you get a very different scale. You get a much higher utilization rate, but at the moment, the capital costs are 3, 4, 5 times that of onshore wind. So I would say let's revisit that equation for India in a decade's time.
Excellent, team. Excellent. So before I move on to next question, I request Mr. Bikram Shenoy and Mr. Arun Kumar Gupta to kindly put your questions in the question box. I am seeing you have raised hand. So requesting you both to kindly put your question in the question box so we can take up and our theme speaker can answer. So I am taking the next question from Mr. Deepak Kumar Gupta, that how India can support Australian energy sector job market for renewable energy, and what education and experience required for technology transfer. Tim, can you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned that there is definitely a need for renewable energy and engineering grid, particularly grid engineering capacity. Australia is going to invest $10 or $20 billion in grid transmission over the next 5 to 10 years, and we definitely don't have the engineering knowledge or capacity to do that. So we are going to be importing recruiting globally for engineers. So if you're a grid engineer, that would be an opportunity. But I would actually argue Australia and India are potentially two of the biggest developers of renewable energy resources in the world, and green hydrogen, green ammonia projects. So in fact, I think there's a lot of similarities. There's no surprises to me that the two richest billionaires in India are actually following the same roadmap as the richest man in Australia, Twiggy Forrest, is following, which is a massive investment in building out domestic Australian and domestic Indian capacity. So rather than necessarily looking at India exporting employment capacity to Australia, I'd be deploying that capacity in India. I would expect the market to double and double again in India over the next 5 years. So yeah, that's probably how I would answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So we are having our next question from Mr. Shubhendu Rai. He has asked that in spite of heavy investment in the renewable energy generation, the consumption of fossil fuel based generation and renewable energy generation is 70% versus 10%, which indicates a huge gap. Do you think more focus shall be paid to demand side management, that is the real-time consumption of renewable energy generated, to reduce this gap, or fossil fuel generation still remain a second source to bridge this gap?
Yeah, it's certainly, the figures are correct that thermal power generation in India is 70% versus 10% for renewables, but India is building a lot of renewables, as I've highlighted. It's also it's a similar answer maybe to your question on electric vehicles, that the upfront capital cost of building wind and solar is high, but once you've built, the marginal cost of operation is tiny. And so you build it all up front and you get a 25-year free electricity from your wind and solar projects. Whereas you build a coal-fired power plant and you end up having to then buy coal every year. And the higher the price of coal, the higher your fuel costs, the higher your power purchase agreement has to go. And so it's worth bearing in mind that capacity is different to generation, is different to profitability. And we need to look at the rate of change as opposed to the absolute. At the end of the day, a robust grid is a diversified grid, and India has huge solar resources, huge wind resources, hydro resources, and coal resources. A diverse grid would actually accommodate all of those rather than just be predominantly one. So is demand response management important? Yes. Maybe not when renewable energy penetration is only 10% of generation, but as it doubles to 20%, 30%, you are going to find the intermittency of wind and solar problematic. And so demand response management becomes increasingly important, as does the integration of batteries on wheels, meaning electric vehicles. So yes, it's important. Far more important in my market, where renewable energy penetration is 33% today. So at the end of the day, 3 times what it is in India, and we're targeting to lift that to 80+% this decade. So demand response management will play a huge role as the penetration of intermittent renewables goes up.
Okay, excellent. So we are having a question from Mr. Arun Kumar Gupta, that what about nuclear power as substitute of coal-based power generation?
Yeah, we in Australia have that discussion all the time. I would guess that Australia in the next 20 years will build precisely zero nuclear. We talk about it all the time, as does everyone in India. But we're a small country and we've got huge wind and solar resources. And like India, we can build them really cost competitively. One of the lessons that Australia has shown is that when it's sunny, which is every day in Australia, it's reliably going to be sunny for 6 or 8 hours almost every day in my home market. Therefore, the price of power goes negative every day for 6 or 8 hours a day. Now, I'm giving a little bit of an unusual answer, but we need to think forward. When you build a nuclear power plant, you're going to own it for the next 60 years. It'll take you 10 years to build it, and you'll then operate it for 50 or 60 years. If the power price, if my forecast on solar is correct, the cost of solar will just get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper till it'll be virtually free when it's sunny. The question then is, how do you actually store it to use it in the evening peak? But if you're operating a nuclear power plant and you need to run 80% of the time to get your return on investment, how do you run 80% of the time? How do you run a baseload power plant, which then has to compete with virtually free solar for 30% of the time? And the answer is it's actually very problematic. So Australia sort of leads the world in this. We have we have no capacity payment. So we have the value of electricity at the time of day market, and we have a very strong signal. So the power price in Australia goes negative for 10 or 15% of the time in summer in Australia. So that's a foretaste of where the market will be. So nuclear power is problematic in my view because it is very expensive, and it can only be built by governments. So your government is funding nuclear power, there is not a private company in the world that will build nuclear power, because it takes $20 or $30 billion to build a nuclear power plant, and it'll take you 10 or 20 years to build it. And the problem, if something goes wrong, only a government can actually provide the insurance on it. Without insurance, a private company can't build nuclear. And most nuclear power companies in the world have gone bankrupt in the last decade. So nuclear is zero emissions technology. I accept that. It is a diversification of the Indian grid. India has aspirations to build nuclear, but you had huge aspirations a decade ago. And last time I checked, India's added maybe 2 gigawatts of new nuclear in the last decade, even though the intent was to add 20 gigawatts. The aspiration is to build 60 gigawatts of nuclear. It just won't happen. It takes too long and it costs too much. You can build solar in a year. It takes you a decade or 20 years to build nuclear. So I'm not a big advocate for nuclear. It's a very expensive and long time to build and expensive to build, but it'll play a role in India. You have the capacity, you have the knowledge and the engineering understanding, but I'd be looking at maybe adding a couple of gigawatts each decade as opposed to the target for 10 or 20 gigawatts. It just hasn't happened.
And another question from the name is not being displayed of the attendee, that lithium prices, as lithium prices are going up, what is the future of lithium ion for long duration storage solutions? Is there any alternate solutions for lithium as of now?
Yeah, it's a very, very clear point. The price of lithium has gone up 500%, 1,000% this year. That's great for the Australian lithium mining industry in the short term, but we are seeing a huge supply response. So I think lithium demand is going to double and double and double again over the next decade as electric vehicles take off. But we do have certainly supply constraints in the near term. Capacity is not growing as fast as demand, and so prices have gone up. Now, that is encouraging the development of other technologies, but at the end of the day, the amount of lithium in a battery is actually relatively small. There's a lot more copper and cobalt and other commodities. And so at the end of the day, batteries prices have gone up this year. They went up last year. They have fallen 50, 60, 70% in the preceding 5 years. But the oil price has doubled. So we need to put the lithium price in perspective against oil. And I do expect a significant expansion in global lithium mining capacity. It will take maybe 5 years for that to really be built out. I think we need to think about storage and firming of the grid in different components. Batteries are very good at short duration storage. Pumped hydro storage is very good at long duration and seasonal duration. More problematic in India with the Himalayan weather patterns. You've got obviously a monsoonal impact. So a lot of your hydro is there actually for flood control as opposed to actually hydroelectricity. In my country, the hydroelectricity is built for electricity generation, so it plays a far more prominent role in peaking capacity. But I think batteries will play a role, electric vehicles will play a role, demand response management will play a role, and we will see a role for gas peaking power plants as well. So, and green hydrogen could play a role 10 years out as well. So there are all sorts of different solutions. There will be new technologies in the battery space to diversify us away from just lithium.
Thank you for your explanation. So Mr. Ganashekaran S, he has asked that is biomass energy production is costlier than other renewable energy like solar and wind?
Yeah, that's very true. Biomass, traditional biomass has been a major power source, energy source across India, as it has across many countries. but it's phasing out. It needs to. Crop burning, as anyone in Delhi knows, is probably the source of 20 or 30% of the air pollution in India, in Delhi, at particular times of the year. And so there's a question. Biomass is not the most cost competitive, but it is a substitute to coal, and NTPC has been developing a program to buy biomass, straw particularly, and crop residue, in order to discourage farmers from burning it, in order to reduce the air pollution. So if we think about the whole energy system and the whole health system of Delhi and of India, the air pollution has a huge health cost. So reducing stubble burning reduces air pollution. That requires a premium price, because obviously biomass is more expensive than coal. It's more expensive than wind and solar. So it will play a role, but I don't think the role is going to be huge. We are seeing some biomass co-firing, but yeah, it will play a role, but not a huge role.
Yeah, thank you. So next question from Mr. Amit Chandra, that how India can emphasize on green hydrogen technology towards energy transition, along with the other renewable technologies, on which we have already built our skill sets, and from cost perspective of green hydrogen technology as well. So one part is the skill set perspective, another is the cost perspective on green hydrogen. So I would like to answer this question, Tim.
Yeah, on the engineering side, I wouldn't come here on spec. I think the Australian government we've actually, because of COVID, had a dramatic reduction of immigration into my country. It is worth bearing in mind India is the second largest race in Australia, behind the Chinese. I think 2 or 3% of the Australian population is of Indian origin. We do have something like 800,000 Indians living in Australia and working, and part of our community. So there is a big Indian contingent. If you have grid transmission skills, I would say that is probably the area that Australia is going to need. So we literally just had a federal election. The new government has committed to spending $20 billion on grid transmission, and the Australian energy market operator today warned of that skills shortage. So it is an area. If your area is more power generation, it's probably less of a need. But yeah, I'm not an advocate for immigration, but yeah, certainly I'm aware we do have a shortage of grid transmission engineers. On green hydrogen, Australia is looking at green hydrogen. We have five of the 5 largest green hydrogen proposals in the world announced in Australia. None of them have started construction because of the question that was asked. The commercialization of hydrogen is still a little way away. And in fact, I think the opportunities for green hydrogen are actually bigger in India than they are in Australia, because India has 800 million farmers. You have a huge fertilizer demand. At the moment, almost all of that fertilizer is imported urea, a fossil fuel derivative, and the opportunity to make ammonium nitrate fertilizers from the electrolyzing of water and electricity from renewable energy is huge, and electrolyzers can be turned on and off instantaneously. So I know I'm talking to an engineering group, so I'm in dangerous territory, but I see one of the opportunities in green hydrogen as a way of absorbing excessive spilled renewable energy. And so you actually operate your electrolyzer as a sort of battery, so you absorb the spilled electricity when it's available, and you turn off when there is high demand for electricity. And so electrolyzers become a way of managing the spilling of renewable energy. So there is a ready market for hydrogen in India. And one of the biggest issues Australia has, as you're probably all aware, we're a long way from India. We're a long way from Japan and Korea and China. We are a huge export nation of bulk commodities and fossil fuels. So the expectation is we're going to be able to export ammonia or hydrogen to Japan and Korea. But the expectation is not matched by a price signal. At the moment, neither Korea nor Japan have a price on carbon emissions, and absent a price on carbon emissions, green hydrogen is not commercially viable and won't be this decade. And India, that is a constraint for your market as well. So players like Reliance are putting their toes in the water. NTPC is trialing green hydrogen, but they're looking to scale up progressively, build domestic capacity, build learning by doing, and then deploy it at huge scale once the cost has come down. And that's probably still 5 to 8 years away.
Yeah, thank you, team. I think I believe that your reply has given answer to the question raised by Mr. Obrojyoti Bodu as well, because he has also asked the employment Australia for the Indians. So that aptly answers, your reply aptly answers his query as well. Now we are taking the last question of the audience, and we are also one raise hand from one of our panelists, Dr. Raju Bosak. So before we I request Dr. Raju Bosak to ask his question. So we are taking last question from the member of audience from Mr. Dipta Sundar Mallik, that what is with the present demand pattern, what can be the maximum penetration of renewables? Is there any effort to redesign the loads to have more penetration of renewables?
Yeah, that is a really important question, and it's something that the Australian energy operator is working on as we speak. The higher the penetration of renewable energy, the more you need to manage the grid, and the more you have two-way flows of power, the more you need demand response management, the more you need batteries. Intermittency is obviously the nature of wind and solar. And so the grid needs to transform from the baseload concept of nuclear and coal power to cheap, low emissions, but intermittent wind and solar. And so I would call out probably the most interesting grid company retailer that I look at in the world is a group in the UK called Octopus Energy. They have something like 3 million customers in the UK. And what they do is they offer their customers a decarbonisation package. They use artificial intelligence to deliver the lowest cost electricity to their customers, but they also engage their customers. And so it's maybe a view to what the grid will look like in India in 10 years' time. It's what the grid will look like in Australia in 10 years' time. So Octopus Energy's number one selling point is every time the power price goes negative in the UK, they give their customers free electricity to charge their electric vehicles and their batteries. Now, you have to have an electric vehicle and a battery to take advantage of that, but effectively their offer is, we will give you free electricity every time the power price goes negative, which in the UK is whenever it's really windy. Now, it's pretty windy in the UK, a big chunk of every day, and so they're offering free charging of batteries. So that then encourages a two-way flow of power. And what I would expect is that as electric vehicles really take off, you will see electric vehicle to grid flows of power. At the moment, you only have flows of power from the grid to the electric vehicle. I think within a couple of years, we'll see vehicle to grid. So we'll use the enormous battery capacity in the electric vehicles to actually feed electricity back into the grid when it's not windy and when it's not solar sunny. And so at the end of the day, what I am talking about is a massive, massive change in the way grids are operated, a much more decentralized grid and a two-way flow of power, and a lot more need for artificial intelligence and smart meters. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So I request Dr. Raju Bosak. He has also raised hand. He's our honorary secretary of West Bengal State Center. I think he has some query to you, team. Dr. Bosak, can you please unmute yourself and?
Is it audible?
Yes, yes, it is absolutely audible.
Actually, I don't want to disturb, but I have a small question. So since we are shifting from fossil fuel to renewable energy gradually, so every year we are setting the target from 2020 to 2030. We have a target. We have in India we have a target to 60 to 70%. We will be able to reach the target. So in Australia there must be some target. I don't know. But what do you think, Mr. Barclay, whether how much target we can reach during this shifting operation?
That is a really good question. Our new federal government's target as of this month is 82% renewable energy by 2030, just 8 years from now. Now, that sounds really high. It is by world standards. It is going to be a challenge technologically, and it's going to be an engineering challenge. Absolutely. We are going to have to modernize our grid aggressively. And at the moment, though, we are at 33% renewable energy penetration. So we manage the grid. We don't have any blackouts. We have one of the highest grid reliabilities in the world, and the grid reliability has gone up every year with the increased penetration of renewables, mainly because the grid investment is going up. And so we're investing in a modern grid and increasing the capacity and the diversity of the grid. But I would point to South Australia. South Australia is a small state in my country. It has the highest penetration of variable renewable energy in the world. It's 1 million people, so tiny by comparison to any state in your country, but 1 million people, and we are getting 100% rooftop solar penetration on individual days in 2022. We're getting 100% solar penetration. We're getting 100+ % renewable energy penetration, variable renewable energy penetration on a regular basis in South Australia. There is not one single coal plant operating in South Australia. There is no hydro in South Australia. And so at the end of the day, the grid has not had a major blackout for 6 years, and yet they have the highest penetration of renewable energy in the world. So we have done a couple of studies at my old company called IEFA, where we analysed South Australia and illustrated that, like Denmark, there are unique circumstances, but we all learn from the leaders. South Australia, like Denmark, is a world leader. Let's learn from them. Let's see what the experiences is for 1 million people and then roll it out for 100 million or 1 billion people. It is possible. I would end by saying the biggest strength of India's energy system, and it's a huge strength, it's unparalleled to any other country in the world. You have one national grid covering 1.4 billion people. China has 2 grids. America has 8 grids. Australia has 2 grids. You have the largest, and you also have a hub and spoke as a country. If you, no disrespect, it's a powerful positive that you have a hub and spoke system, so that the grid capacity, when it's windy in Tamil Nadu, it's not going to be windy in Gujarat. When it's sunny in Gujarat, it's evening in Bangladesh. And so you can export power to Bangladesh or to Odisha or to Chhattisgarh. So at the end of the day, the biggest strength of India is your national grid. It is far more modern than people give it credit for. And I would remind you, as you would all be very proud of, when Prime Minister Modi asked for 9 minutes of blackout, that was an amazing test of the strength of your grid, and you passed with flying colours. So never underestimate your domestic strengths. It's easy to point out the negatives, but the biggest positive in India, apart from your very cheap wind and solar, is your national grid.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
team. Thank you. And now we have come to the concluding portion of this online event. And as a customary, I request Professor Dr. Raju Bosak, Honorary Secretary of West Bengal State Center IEI, to kindly deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Is it audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you, Mr. Anirban Datta, our Joint Honorary Secretary, for giving me the opportunity for propose the vote of thanks. It is a proud privilege to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to all the distinguished panelists in the technical webinar on the theme, the energy transition of South Asia and Australian perspectives on growing needs for decarbonization and role of global finance, policy and technology as accelerator. Organized by the Mechanical Engineering Division, West Bengal State Center IEI, through online platform Zoom. At the outset, I convey my sincere thanks to the panelist, Mr. Tim Buckley, Director, Climate Energy Finance Australia, has given his wonderful lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. My sincere thanks also goes to Dr. Nirmal Das, Chairman, West Bengal State Center IEI, Dr. H.O. Thackeray, President IEI, Engineer Sandeep Kumar Dev, Vice President IEI, Dr. N.T. Rangareddy, Chairman, Mechanical Engineering Division Board IEI, Dr. G. Ranganath, Chairman, Committee of Advancement of Technology and Engineering IEI, Mr. Bhaskar Datta, Business Consultant and Vice President of ThyssenKrupp Industries and Convener of Mechanical Engineering Division, West Bengal State Center IEI, Mr. Anirban Datta, our Joint Honorary Secretary, West Bengal State Center IEI, and my sincere thanks also goes to all members of the Council of Division Board member of MCDB, all members of the Committee West Bengal State Center IEI, and all members of the Mechanical Engineering Divisional subcommittees, Director Technical IEI and his team for their wholehearted support to make the program grand success. Last but not the least, my sincere thanks also goes to all those who are behind the screen and giving their silent support to make the program grand success. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Bosak. And with this, I request the IEI headquarters to stop the live streaming. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim Buckley. Wonderful presentation. Good.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.